Welcome to a special Saturday edition of the Daily Dose of Septuagint, and today we're going to take a look at another book, as I do on occasion. This one's a bit of a blast from the past. It is the T&T Clark Companion to the Septuagint, and it's over a decade old now, but it's still a significant work in the field, and so looking forward to providing a basic overview of the book. Now, that title may sound a little bit familiar. Several weeks or months ago, I did a video on the T&T Clark Companion to Septuagint Research, and that one was done by Will Ross and Ed Glennie. And I mentioned in that video that it was essentially the buddy volume to this original T&T Clark Companion on Septuagint stuff. And so they kind of work hand in hand and do different things. And so let's get into it. This book was edited by James K. Aitken. As you can see there, he was known by Jim by his friends and colleagues, and he was a longtime professor and researcher at the University of Cambridge Faculty of Divinity. You see picture there. He has trained a ton of students. In fact, he probably is one of the most influential guys in terms of having a big family tree, if you will, of PhD students who've gone on and done great things in the field. I was not actually one of his students, although he was my internal examiner for my PhD defense. But sadly, in 2023, he died of a heart attack and left a huge gap, obviously, in relationships, but also in the field. And there's lots of different ways in which his students have honored him in recent years. So in many respects, this video is a very small tribute to him as well. He'd actually had some health issues while I was at Cambridge, and then after long since I had gone, he had this heart attack. So very, very sad. So a lot of folks remember him quite fondly, of course. And so let's get into the book itself. One of the reasons why I wanted to cover it as well is that it does have some personal significance for me. While I was a lowly student, I ended up being his editorial assistant for this book, getting the chapters and doing editing and that kind of stuff. In fact, I looked back through my cloud drive and found all the old files and all of our track changes and comments and so forth. And so we worked for probably 5 or 6 months putting the finishing touches on this book as the different submissions were coming in. And so it was a great experience. That was when I was really cutting my teeth on the field. And I appreciate him letting me study under him in that respect, even though I was a New Testament student and not directly involved in Septuagint research. So let's get into the basic overview and structure of the book. It begins with an introduction by Jim himself, and as you might expect, it does things like define what exactly do we mean by this term, Septuagint. It talks about the origins and the different theories about why it existed and where it came from. It talks about the translation of the Pentateuch and then the other books after that, some of the texts and manuscripts, which we've been looking at in Daily Dose, the editions, which we've also been looking at various points, modern translations like Netz and the Lexham. Well, actually, I don't think he had covered the Lexham one. It wasn't out yet, but he looked at like the German ones and the French ones, and then recent scholarship. And that other handbook is really double-clicking on that particular issue and taking the recent scholarship and then building a whole book out of that, which is what the Ross-Glennie book did. So that's the introduction. And then there are 38 chapters devoted to each book in essentially Rolf's Honhart, which we've covered previously. So that includes the books that are part of the traditional Hebrew canon, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, the prophets, and so forth. But it also includes the so-called apocryphal and or deuterocanonical books, and it also includes those that are not traditionally part of that corpus, but are included in Rolf's Honhart, like 3rd Maccabees, 4th Maccabees, the Septuagint Odes, and so forth. So it has chapters on those as well. He chose to model the contents based on Rolf's Honhart. And each chapter, and the contributing authors did a great job on this, more so than probably a lot of books. Where you start to see people take a lot of poetic license with how they want to do their chapter. They stuck to a pretty consistent outline as advised by Jim, and so each one is going to start with the available editions and translations, which is actually not a trivial point. As I've covered in other videos, not all of the standard critical editions like Cambridge or Göttingen have all the books covered yet. And so in certain books, you might not know exactly where to get the best text. It could be a dissertation for all you know, or some sort of off the beaten path edition until the Göttingen edition comes out. And so that's actually a pretty helpful little starting point. It talks about the basic characteristics of each book, when and where it was translated to the extent that we know, some of the details about language and translation. So this gets into the idiosyncrasies of each translator. To what degree is it word for word, or maybe this one's more paraphrastic. Sometimes they're doing funny things with vocabulary or syntax, so you get into that kind of detail at the book level, because you can't talk about that in macro terms because it's not like one consistent approach throughout the entire corpus. Text critical issues are, in some respects, more important for certain chapters than others, although all have them. So, of course, Daniel, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and to a lesser degree Exodus, Judges, and so forth, they all have significant text critical issues. Some others, it might be less important, but you get into those either way. Some of the reception history. So, to what degree did other Second Temple Jewish Greek writers like Aristobulus or whomever, Josephus, what have you, make use of the Greek translation? New Testament authors, church fathers, that kind of thing. And then lastly, bibliographies for each one. So that's the basic outline of each major chapter. Make a few comments about that introduction, though. One of the brilliant things about Jim's writing, for those who know him, is that he was able to do a lot with very few words. Very, very gifted at that. And so in that introductory chapter, which is only like 10 pages, he accomplishes a ton, and it really becomes, it's kind of a way in which he can distill some of the best overall introductions to the Septuagint into a small space. And so in it, you're going to get the core elements that you're going to find like in the Job Silva book, or Kreuser's book, Jen Dine's book, my own book with Will Ross, which is the main one you should buy. You should still go buy that one. Ed Gallagher's book, Fernandez Marcos' book. So he's able to take a lot of complicated information that are covered in those introductions and distill them down to one chapter, which is not easy. And so that one chapter alone is really worth its weight in gold. So very, very impressive work there. Let's now get into the broader table of contents, each of these 38 chapters. And I'm not going to go through them in detail, but I just want you to be familiar with which books are covered and some of the key authors. So, of course, we have the Pentateuch first off, and you have Mark Scarlatta, Allison Salveson, several folks who are very well known in the field, but you also have authors who perhaps are less well known, but still this might be like their particular specialties, Greek Leviticus or what have you. You got Joshua, of course, that's a tricky chapter, as is Judges, Abraham Bond doing Ruth. Of course, the Kingdoms plus Chronicles or Paralipomena, those are very difficult chapters. You got Timothy Michael Law there because there's so many issues with them. You have two dedicated, of course, to the books of Esdras, one being the sort of canonical component of Ezra and Nehemiah, the other being the kind of remix, if you will. Moving down, you have Esther plus the additions, that really well done. Cameron Boyd Taylor on that one in terms of distinguishing the core book of Exodus plus the Greek additions. Judith, Tobit, the four Maccabees with various specialists on that. Psalms, of course, done by Jim himself. He was that was one of his major fields, is Psalms. You actually see his name show up a lot through here. One of the interesting things that you get insight into with respect to putting together a book, especially an edited volume, is how complicated that workflow might be. And so there are a few places where Jim had not assigned himself as the author. Someone else was supposed to do it. But people miss their deadlines, and you beg and you plead, and they say, we're going to get you the book or the chapter, and they don't, and you're waiting, and you're waiting. You're up against a deadline, in this case with T&T Clark. And in certain situations, Jim was like, I'm just going to do it. And so he would just write the chapter because we're not going to hit the deadline if we don't. And so I don't remember exactly which ones that was true for, but I know it was several of them. I don't even know who the original contributors were supposed to be, but they never sent it, and they never sent anything in. Therefore, they didn't end up in the book. But Jim did a great job picking up the slack there. You got the Song of Songs, Job by Claude Cox, and so forth. There's Jim showing up again. Moving on to the final set here, you got Sirach by Benjamin Wright. You got Jen Dines doing the Minor Prophets. Isaiah, the other major prophets, and so on. So that gives you a feel for the basic outline of the book. Now, what's interesting is that we did do one special, dedicated chapter for Daniel, both the Old Greek and Theodotian texts, because those are very, very complicated. And then we had a separate chapter on the additions to Daniel. So that was unlike what we did with Esther. Esther was just one combined chapter. In this particular case, we also had a separate one on the Epistle of Jeremiah. But this particular case, it made sense to focus on the core book of Daniel and then do the additions separately, because there really are a lot of different issues that come into play there. So that's the basic flow of the book. A few things I appreciate. First off, in one paragraph, this is back to Jim's intro. He kicks off with why study the Septuagint. You can see it's not long. It's not a lot of words, but in one paragraph, he's able to really distill down a lot of brilliant insights as to why we're doing any of this. Why do I do Daily Dose? Why does anyone focus on this? And he basically boils it down to 5 things: the text critical use or the text critical study of the Septuagint, both in terms of editing the Hebrew Bible where it's needed, versus, and also just the text criticism of itself, because that alone is interesting in terms of reception history. How it's a window on early biblical exegesis and interpretation. How it was, in many respects, the tradition, not just one particular version of the Septuagint, but the entire Greek stream, if you will, that was used by early Christians, including the apostles, how significant it is for the study of post-classical Greek. And that's actually one of Jim's major contributions to the field is, in essence, moving Septuagint studies upstream in appreciation for the Greek itself. There had been a school of thought that, look, this is just a window to the Hebrew. It doesn't matter in its own right. He's saying, no, this is not bad Greek. This is good Greek. It's just different Greek. And it's really, really insightful in terms of how we can study the development of Ptolemaic or post-classical Greek. And then also, this is a massive contribution to the study of ancient translation technique, being the biggest translation project of its kind in the ancient world. So that one paragraph alone is quite insightful. One of the things I really like about this book that makes it different than a lot of the others, certainly different than the basic introductions, because it goes book by book, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and so forth. Each author does his best or her best to capture what's the nature of the Greek in this book. So, for instance, the Genesis chapter is going to talk about how, well, hey, it follows very close lexical and syntactical relationship to the Hebrew parent text, gets into that because that is true for the Genesis translator. It still is good Greek, but it is going to be more isomorphic. It's going to lean in the direction of trying to match the Hebrew word order, those kinds of things. But nevertheless, at least most of the authors of this volume still believe that it's readable Greek, it's passable, it's not clunky Greek, that kind of thing. In contrast, you have, for instance, Isaiah. And Isaiah functions very differently. The translation philosophy is quite different. The way it works is different and raises a lot more kind of fascinating questions. So that chapter does a very good job outlining that. And then you have Ecclesiastes kind of all over the place, Proverbs, Job, and so on. So each chapter has these really helpful descriptions of what to expect in terms of the translation philosophy, the nature, the quality of the Greek, what's going on with the vocab, and that kind of thing. So very, very helpful stuff there. Along the way, you'll also run into really helpful data. And so the table that is in the Jeremiah chapter in terms of clarifying the insane way in which the versification works between the Göttingen edition, the Rolfs-Honhart edition, and the Masoretic text. In fact, you could probably add another column for the Hebrew, for the English Bible. That is an enormous mess if you know anything about the Septuagint and Jeremiah. And so this table is really helpful clarifying, like if I look up chapter 28, verse whatever, what is it in the Septuagint and that kind of thing. So it's really, really complicated set of issues. And so really helpful data there. Same thing with the Esdras books. How does it map? How do they map to one another? The bibliographies, of course, are quite helpful. Again, they're 10 years old, but still is going to point you to the right places to dig in. Of course, the more recent companion volume is going to have more updated bibliographies, but these are still helpful. So that's it in a nutshell. Hopefully this has been a little whirlwind tour through this book. The hardback is still quite expensive, but there are paperback editions that are more reasonable. So if you don't have it, I would encourage you to check it out. I still use it a lot, especially when I'm getting into specific books and trying to understand, hey, what's going on with Greek Ezekiel here? This is still, in my opinion, one of the big go-tos. So hopefully you enjoyed this T&T Clark companion to the Septuagint.